Welcome to Discussing Fitchburg Now. I'm your host, Sam Squalia. This week's show is on forest protection and climate change. And I have some of my favorite forest protection advocates with me to talk about this subject. I have Dr. Ralph Baker, an environmental scientist, and Anna Wilkins, the executive director of the North County Land Trust. Thanks, guys, for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, so you guys work with forest management a lot, right? I know you do, Anna, and in your career, Ralph, you've worked with forest, preservation and management, right?
Actually, it's a relatively new thing for me. My career was in hazardous waste cleanup.
Of exterior environment?
Of soil and groundwater contaminated by industrial chemicals, and I did that for about 35 years.
Okay.
And now I'm, since retirement 3 years ago, I've sort of been returning to my roots, my fundamental passion. Yeah, exactly. Which I've always been kind of in love with forests, and this is something that I'm picked up since retirement. Okay.
Yeah. And Anna, and so the North County Land Trust, how many forests does that manage?
Well, we have, we have about 1,000 acres that we own, and then another almost 1,000 acres of private conservation restrictions, which are privately held, still by those owners, but we basically make sure that no development happens on that land. So of the properties that we have 7 publicly accessible forests with trails on them, including the Crocker Conservation Area in Fitchburg.
Right at the end of Prospect Street?
Yep, Flat Rock Road it turns into, and overlook reservoirs there. That's 174 acres. So that's actually one forested area that we did have a timber harvest on, but every single property that we have has its own management regimen, and so I think the timber harvest for that one was about I don't want to misquote, but I think it was about 60 acres that we had harvest out of the 174.
In a timber harvest.
In a timber harvest. That was about 7 years ago before I came on, but
okay.
Yeah. So that's and I can talk more about that at another. Go into a little more detail about that. But in general, that's, I mention we're a regional land trust. We're not just in Fitchburg.
Yes.
So
you didn't mention that, but now you did.
Right. So the 1,000 acres that we have is spread out over, 7 different towns within north central Massachusetts. Crocker Conservation Area being the one in Fitchburg that's publicly accessible. So, yeah, so that's that in a nutshell.
So now, why do we, protect all these forests? Why do we manage it? Let's talk about that. Like
sure.
the why.
Well,
what are we doing with the forests here?
Traditionally, forest land has been managed for a number of reasons by conservationists for the value that the forest plays in terms of providing a place for wildlife, for recreation, for maintaining water quality. That's why the city of Fitchburg owns about 4,000 acres of watershed protection land, is to provide water for the public water supply. I think they control about 15 reservoirs and all the dams associated with that, and they have 2 water treatment plants, one in Fitchburg, one in Westminster.
Fitchburg has a lot of water.
Fitchburg has a lot of water.
And really nice water.
Really good water. Fitchburg has some of the best water.
Yep.
So that being said, there's some things that we probably don't appreciate historically about forests that are really important, and that's where the whole subject of climate change comes into this, at least from my perspective. Right now we're in a kind of a unique situation where the climate is changing at a very dramatic rate. As Governor Jay Inslee of Washington State put it, we're the first generation to recognize the problem of climate change, and we're the last generation that's going to be able to do anything about it because it's happening so fast. And it turns out that forests can play a very important role in helping to mitigate or slow down the rate of carbon that's being emitted into the atmosphere, because the trees absorb carbon. They breathe it in photosynthesis. And in doing so, they build the bones of the structures of the trees. And other plants do that, of course, too, but forests do it particularly well. In fact, the overall amount of carbon dioxide that forests in the United States absorb is about equal to the overall amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that the entire transportation sector is emitting into the atmosphere. So that's how big a role forests can play. Of course, we're not here to talk about global issues because this is a Fitchburg show, but I think the point is that we can make a difference right here, locally, on a problem that's global in scale.
So when we talk about forest management, we're talking about, we often talk about our local, what the forest does for our local watershed, or what the forest does for our local wildlife. When you cut down more forests, more bears and deer seem to come out. Right? That's one other local impact that you might have. We have forest fires. Right? Maybe not in Massachusetts, but
no, we actually, we've had some pretty bad ones in history.
Oh, in our area?
Yeah, in the 1940s, there was a long period of drought, and there was a very serious forest fire that swept through the area and burned up a number of residences. Not like what's just happened in California, not to that scale, but bad enough so that a lot of historians know about the fires of the 40s. So it can happen.
So, we have so obviously forest fires is another issue, but then we also have the global issue of our overall forest coverage on the planet Earth as well, right?
Right.
I grew up thinking for a long time that it's the tropical forests like the Amazon that are the so-called green lungs of the planet, and that the
major carbon sequesters.
Yeah, they do a tremendous job in terms of providing a sink for carbon dioxide and emitting oxygen so that we can breathe. But it turns out that we live in the midst of one of the most productive forests in the whole United States.
In the Northeast?
In the Northeast, and in particular right around here in Massachusetts. I don't know if you folks are bringing up slides yet, but I have a slide that shows this very well. It's slide 6.
Can you pull up slide 6, please, Matt?
Since we're on this topic. And it shows where carbon is being sequestered. And you can see that right in this part of the Northeast is one of the most productive of all the areas.
The green is the most productive.
Yes.
And the lightest green is
the
lightest of the green.
The brightest of the green is where the most carbon is being stored in the trees. So why is that? Because we have a good climate, we have good soil.
We're very wet.
We have we have quite a lot of precipitation. So it's maybe not quite to the point of like the Pacific Northwest, which is renowned as, place where there's really big trees.
The giant sequoias.
Yeah, exactly. But here it's really important. So by protecting our forests, we also, in addition to those other reasons that we talked about before, we can help to reverse and mitigate climate change if we're careful about the way that we protect our forests.
Yeah.
If we continue to treat them the way we have for a long time, which is to view them more as a commodity,
for cutting it down for lumber and paper.
For lumber and paper products and stuff like that, which we do need to do, but we could benefit greatly if we start to think of carbon sequestration, in other words, the storage of carbon in those trees, as one of the important goals. And we could even get paid. We'll talk about that later in the show, I think. Yeah. We could even, the city of Fitchburg could even get paid for maintaining forests in a standing condition, as opposed to rotating harvests through them every 20 years as they have been doing.
Talk about forest management.
Yeah.
Can we pull this slide up on the screen that's here?
This one.
Let's talk about let's talk about where does our carbon go inside a tree? Can you run us through this, guys?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to speak to this because recently at a conference I heard the lead scientist for the Northeast region for the Nature Conservancy talk, and he explained this in a way that really a light bulb went off for me, because I love trees, I love forests, I spend more time outside than
total tree hugger.
Total. Well, yeah, it's in a way. Although I do own a chainsaw as well, and I'm but
as
the thing was, yeah. So he explained it. He said, if you think about it, so much of the carbon is stored in those living, growing trees, and if you think about it. When you think of a tree growing, do you think it grows up from the ground or out of the sky?
Ground.
Up from the ground. Yes, everybody thinks of it growing up from the ground. So if you think about this, take a piece of land and weigh the soil in your mind. Now, let trees grow on that piece of land up for 50, 100 years. Now, remove the trees, all the branches, everything, and weigh the soil again. It's going to weigh the same, because the tree is not building what it's growing. The substance of the tree is not taking from the ground. What's happening is that as soon as the tree sprouts and there's the first little leaves, it starts doing photosynthesis, which is taking carbon dioxide, mixing it with water and sunlight, and creating the structure of the tree.
So it's filtering from the air to grow. It's basically coming out of thin air. They're growing out of thin air. So if you think of,
you
need to talk to your plants.
Exactly. If you think of frost on a window pane, how it grows from getting the condensation of the moisture in the air, it kind of grows these patterns on that cold window. The trees are basically growing like frost from the carbon that it's grabbing out of the air and turning into that tree structure. So when you look at a tree, you're looking at a visual representation of the carbon that has been pulled from the air.
That's a beautiful insight.
Yeah.
I'd like to add something to that from the perspective of a soil scientist. That's actually the portion that's your career. That's the part of environmental science that I have focused on in my career. And not only is the body of the tree made largely of carbon. It's things like cellulose and lignin and stuff like that. But also a lot of the carbon that went into that tree and other trees that lived there, as well as the other plants, the smaller plants, ends up in the soil, so that about 50% of the overall amount of carbon that's stored in the forest is in the soil. It's not only in the trees. We tend to think of it mostly as the trees, but it's also in the soil. And actually one of the detrimental...
I guess the leaves decay.
The leaves decay, they build up. It builds soil organic matter, and just as it does in your garden. It stays in the ground if it's managed properly. If it's not managed well, we'll lose it. It can degrade, and that's one of the unfortunate results of logging carelessly. You can actually not only lose a lot of the carbon that was in those trees because it gets cut and taken somewhere, maybe burned in some cases, but it also can degrade what's in the soil. So in trying to adopt this new goal for forest management of not only the things we talked about, the wildlife, water, recreation, those kinds of amenities, but also storing carbon, it's important to manage with the thought in mind of the soil, not just the trees. So it's really an interesting topic, and a lot of people are very much focused on it.
So let's start talking about some of the issues that we have. Let's pull up this. Can we pull this up on the main slide for our audience?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about this. This is a picture of an area in Fitchburg's northern watershed. The city of Fitchburg owns 4,000 acres public watershed land, and
That's
they've
Fitchburg and Ashby and Ashburnham.
been not Ashburnham, Ashby, Westminster,
Okay.
Hubbardston, mostly those towns.
Yep.
So anyway, this is a portion of the northern watershed in Fitchburg, but close to Ashby,
Yep.
where a harvest was carried out around 2010. And as you can see, they removed a lot of the trees that were standing there.
This was the goal was to was this a forest management plan?
It was according to a forest management plan,
Okay.
but about 50% or more of the standing trees were removed.
In the entire northern watershed?
No, in this block.
Oh, in this
they tend to
area.
do it in like 200-acre blocks, and they've been rotating around from block to block. So I took this picture to show people what it looked like in the areas that had been recently harvested. And it does have some benefits from the standpoint of
New growth?
well, I was going to say providing the city with some income from the trees that have grown.
About how much do we make on 100 acres?
Not a lot, maybe $10,000. It's not a lot, and we could probably compensate the city just as much from those sale of carbon credits that I mentioned earlier. But again, we can get into that later. It doesn't improve the water quality. It may improve water quantity, but water quantity hasn't been a problem for the city. The city has more water than it needs.
Not the past couple of years, our reservoirs are full.
It can compact the soil, it can cause runoff problems, and it can allow invasive species to come in, which is actually a pretty big problem in a lot of our forests now. These are things like Japanese knotweed, bittersweet. There's a whole host of ones that could be mentioned.
We have a big problem with that in a lot of areas, especially along the river.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the way that the oversight of the logging is done doesn't necessarily afford a lot of attention to be paid to these kinds of consequential impacts that happen during the logging.
So this forest management plan maybe was a little too aggressive, in my
opinion. And
so what's the problem in this picture?
Well, a lot of trees have been removed.
Too many?
Yes, in my opinion. Okay. And it was actually a healthy forest before. Some foresters would say, well, it can be made healthier by removing some trees. The problem is, from my perspective, that the issue with climate change is now so pressing that we can't afford to wait 20, 30, 40, 50 years for the forest to regrow and restore all that stored carbon, because we don't have that long. So that's why I'm feeling like we need to adopt a different way of looking at the problem.
A different forest management plan?
Yes, yeah. And so this is, unfortunately, this is also a local problem.
Oh, can you bring this up on the screen? We're talking about biomass.
Yeah.
So these are like the compressed pellets for your stove?
Yes, more or less. But this is a lot of the debris from the cutting of the forest in recent years has been going to facilities like Pinetree Power, which is in Westminster, right over the line from Fitchburg.
Yeah, right past Great Wolf.
Yes, right past Great Wolf. And at this facility, they take the chipped up trees and they turn it into electricity. Unfortunately, using that kind of material, which we call biomass, to create electricity is dirtier than burning coal.
Yeah.
It's about 50% dirtier than burning coal, and that's because it takes a lot of energy to evaporate all the water that's in the wood. And it also puts out particulate matter in the atmosphere that's about 1,000 times higher than what would come out of a clean burning power plant. So it's really problematic from a health standpoint, and this facility has been fined by DEP several times for emissions violations.
Really? What was the last, was it recently?
I can't give you the exact date, but I know that there's a link there to Sentinel Enterprise article about that. So
does that also have a similar problem with wood stoves? You know?
That's a much smaller scale problem, quite honestly.
So when I burn wood in my wood stove, I'm okay.
I do it too. I do it with trees that have died, which a tree that has died is going to decay and produce CO2 anyway. So if you cut it up and put it in your wood stove, it's not really the same thing as taking trees that were alive, chipping them up, and burning them for electricity. So I think that the idea of taking the tops and branches of trees that have been logged and chipping them up and sending them to make electricity is kind of a flawed idea. It's not allowing that organic matter to go back into the soil to replenish the nutrients and the growing capacity of the forest. It's removing them. It's kind of a sort of mining.
You're kind of breaking the cycle.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I wanted to bring it up. I'm sure there'd be plenty of people that might argue with me. Bring it on, because I'm happy to talk about it.
All right, and then this slide here, it says the largest and oldest trees are found in unmanaged forests, and these trees remove the most carbon. So I take it that not all our forests in the United States are managed. What forests aren't managed?
Not very many, unfortunately, but I mean there are a fair number. Such as the ones.
Are all your forests managed in some way, Anna?
No. I mean, I think, so when you're talking about forest management from a landowner perspective, and, you know, as a land trust, we're a landowner, but there's private, you know, Ralph has woods behind his house, and, you know, the city of Fitchburg is a landowner and manages its forests. So anytime you're making management decisions about your forests, you first of all want to start with your goals for your land. And whenever we acquire a parcel of land that has forests, just as a matter of course, we have a forester do a forest stewardship plan for us, and with an eye towards health of the forest from a biodiversity standpoint and from a wildlife management standpoint.
So there's a few different ways a forester could look at a grove of trees as a commodity to be sold with the side benefit of managing the forest, or as a biodiversity, selective cutting.
They really take the cue from the landowner, and what the landowner states to them.
What is your main goal?
Exactly.
So if your main goal is to make money, or say like, well, I'm 30, I just bought this land. When I'm 70 and I'm ready to retire, I want to harvest it to make a retirement fund for myself. The forester is going to probably suggest you do a thinning cut, suggest that you do some limbing on some of the straight pines. So he's going to be looking at the forest from a commodity standpoint and saying, here's how you can maximize the timber values of your land.
Like how a Christmas tree farm would think about their land. Like a forester doing a Christmas tree farm would be thinking about it a lot differently than a biodiversity managed forest. Exactly.
So you start out with your goals when you're talking about forest management and you're a landowner. And so, you know, the timber harvests that we've done have all been in the pursuit of a greater diversity of species in the forest, or repairing. So we just this past year finished a timber harvest on our Rome Conservation Area in Gardner, and that was through an NRCS grant. The Rome Conservation Area had a timber harvest at one point that was high graded, basically taking all of the high value trees out and leaving the rest.
Maybe to pay for their programs, or
it was
as a commodity.
It was before the land trust received the property as a donation.
Right. Okay.
So I don't know at one point in time that occurred, but this was the forester's assessment when he went out there. He could tell just by what species were there, what stumps were left, what the composition of the forest was, so that we were eligible for a grant to improve the stand, and I put air quotes around that because whenever you improve anything in nature, there are winners and losers.
Right.
So any sort of management decision that you make for your land, even when you've got an eye towards wildlife or biodiversity, you're going to have an impact that's going to be good for certain things and not so good for others. If you want scarlet tanagers, you don't want to cut your forest. If you want woodcock, you definitely want that young shrubby growth, because they have two totally different areas that they need for habitats. So you start with your goals, you work from there with your forester. Now, having said that, I think there's a huge place for us to think about as a society, as a community, as people who are all part owners of our forests, our public forests. How do we want our public forests managed?
Is there a regulation at a larger level on how we manage the forest through the EPA or through the Department of Forestry?
Not so much. No, the DCR, the State Department of Conservation and Recreation, which is a very large landowner of state-owned forests, does have policies about these kinds of things. But no, they don't apply to private landowners, nor does any federal program that I'm aware of stipulate what private landowners can do.
Only if it's within certain distance from
a wetland, yes,
right.
yes,
or
yes.
a natural
that's a
water
good That's a good
source.
point, and
Yes.
yeah, that's very true. But if you look at our city, let's say in an air photo, one of the things you can rapidly conclude is a lot of our forests are quite fragmented by the pattern of development. There's a lot of development that's occurred along roads, and actually there's not very much, let's say, deep forest or really old forest in this area.
Well, if you look at pictures of Fitchburg from 100 years ago, it was all barren.
Yeah.
Well, right, and so our oldest forests are the ones that our oldest forests today are the ones that have pretty much been left untouched since they went back to become trees again.
Right.
And so that means they're maybe 100 years old, 120 years old, and there aren't that many of them that are that old. Why? Because people are doing the kinds of things that we're talking about. The inescapable reality for the 21st century, I think, is that we need to change the way that we've been treating these forests and let more forests get old. You know, it used to be thought by foresters and forest scientists that the oldest trees kind of get, you know, they get aged, they become senescent, they don't grow very much anymore. But the fact is that the latest science is showing that it's the oldest trees
that hold the most.
That are actually pulling the most carbon out of the atmosphere. And I'm talking about trees that are, let's say, between 100 and 200 years old. Those are not old for most tree species. They might be when they get 300, 400 years old. But they can still grow so much that the largest trees will sequester much more carbon than the small trees that will replace them, let's say 10, 20 years hence. And that is a game changer from the way that we look at the forest. There's so many other benefits, as Anna said, in terms of biodiversity, to allowing trees to get old growth characteristics in our forests, that there's a lot of benefit that we could be deriving by letting our forests get older.
Right. Okay, on that note, we're going to take a short break, and then we'll come back and we'll start talking more about how we're working to better protect our forests, and especially in our surrounding area. Okay, we'll see you in a few minutes.
Hello and welcome to FATV, Fitchburg Access Television. Each week we take pride in providing some of the best public access television programs in New England. From FATV live sporting events, city meetings, and school functions, to weekly shows such as Barbara and You, Inside and Discussing Fitchburg, Sports Weekly, Weekly Wellness, and Our City. Our dedicated staff of industry professionals and hard-working volunteers is here each week working behind the scenes, making it all happen. Besides on air, our programming is also shown live online, where you can see our shows in beautiful high definition. You can also search through our archive of past shows and watch anytime at your leisure. But did you know you can also be part of the action? Become a member of FATV, and you gain access to all the equipment, studio space, and classes that FATV has to offer. You can create your own show, volunteer for exciting live events in our studio, or all around the city in our high-quality mobile broadcast truck. The possibilities are endless. For a small fee, you can become an individual member. Or for a little more, you and a group of friends can become part of a rising trend in the future of television. From sports shows to news shows, civic events, and talk shows, you can be in the driver's seat by directing and even starring in your own production. Also, students are free. FATV staff can assist you by getting your new show up and running with professional industry standard equipment, TV studio time, and private editing suites. All you need are friends to help out, and before you know it, you will be on the air. So if you have a great idea for a TV show and want to share it with the world, stop by 175 Kimball Street, Fitchburg for a free tour of our facility. You can also contact us at 978-343-0834 or email us at info@fatv.org. Fitchburg Access Television, working together for a stronger community.
And we're back on Discussing Fitchburg Now. We're talking about forest protection and forest management now. So let's start with, we're talking about losing biodiversity. Anna, you were talking about, using your forester with North County Land Trust with an eye for biodiversity of the forest.
Right.
So let's pull this chart up on the screen. And Ralph, if you could explain what's going on in this chart.
This is a chart that represents something called the Living Planet Index and how it has indicated that we have lost about 70% of our global biodiversity from 1970 to around 2003.
Especially fresh water, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, unfortunately, this is happening in pretty much every kind of ecosystem. There aren't that many places on the Earth where we have long-term data on things like insects. But as an example, recent study in a very large natural, it's actually a national forest in eastern Puerto Rico, showed that between 1970 and the present, about 90% of the insect species that lived in this national forest have disappeared.
In only a few short years.
90%.
40 years?
And they're seeing the same thing in Europe. In Germany, happened to be another place where they've looked at biodiversity. We're losing a lot of species. And we may not know even much about them, unfortunately, because
or what roles that they serve
exactly
in the larger system.
If you go on to the next slide, it's like we're playing a dangerous Jenga game.
Oh, can we pull that slide up on the screen with the dangerous Jenga?
You've probably seen these games where you pull out a piece of wood and you try to see, how long you can keep the structure from toppling.
And it looks like this guy tried to pull them out all from the bottom.
Well, we're basically removing species through careless management, pesticides, and a whole host of other insults that unfortunately are going on today, and we don't know what effect it's going to have on life on this planet. So we can't do you know, we can't be custodians of the whole planet, but we can locally. We can think about it locally and do something about it locally, and that's, I think, what this conversation is about right now.
Yeah, I think you know, there are diversity. There's species diversity in habitats and across habitats. So within your habitat, you're looking for you know, a diversity of species from the ground cover all the way up to the canopy, from the vegetation to the creatures that inhabit that vegetation. And then across your landscape, you're going to look for, you know, where are the marshy areas going, you know, into conifer forests, going into upwood hardwood forests, going into, you know, agricultural lands and open or early successional forested areas. So you're also looking for that kind of diversity
on a larger system
scale. So, and it's really important for us to have these core areas of older forests that are allowed to become old forest instead of coming and as part of that matrix. You know,
does old forest count for hardwood and for softwood? Yeah,
I mean, whatever the forest wants to be, and that's really an interesting kind of concept for us as people, because we like to muck around with everything. But the forest has its own agenda, and if it's allowed to kind of grow what it wants and do what it wants, it's going to be much more resilient as changes happen. You know, the more that we try to make the forest be what we want it to be, the less species diversity there's going to be, because we want, you know, if we're managing for that timber, you know, 50 years from now, we only want the oaks and we only want the tall straight pines and the maple. But if the forest's allowed to kind of become its own ecosystem, and then whatever comes later on, it's going to be able to spring back from whatever stressors are coming, drought or too much rain or whatever, increasing temperatures. It's going to be able to moderate that much more so than any managed forest.
So on that note, when we can segue into what we're talking about with the Baker Family Public Forest Reserve, which this was your doing, Ralph. Let's talk about why that you.
Sure. So in the northwestern corner of Fitchburg, a part of that 4,000 acres of city-owned land was all marked and ready to be harvested.
How many acres? 4,000?
Well, this is 205 acres out of 4,000 that the city owns.
Oh, okay, so 205 acres in this particular, in the green areas.
Yes, in the green areas on that map.
These are owned by the city of Fitchburg.
Owned by the city, and subject to a conservation restriction that Mass Fish and Wildlife already had secured on the land, so it couldn't be developed, but it could be logged. It could be logged. And it was all marked. The trees were marked, and a logging plan was in place.
Or a forest management plan that included logging. And the reason that the city has a conservation restriction on this land is because it's watershed protection land.
That's right, and because the state was willing to pony up $1 million or so for the city to purchase a conservation restriction on that land. So the city agreed to do that in 2009. So anyway, it was more like 2014 when we noticed all the marks on the trees, and I approached the city and said, hey, I know you're doing this to get some income for the water department. How about if I offset that loss of income were you to agree not to log this land? And they finally agreed to do that for 30 years, and it's renewable under similar terms if somebody steps up to the plate 30 years from now. So we were able to preserve this land the way it is. Some of it already has old growth characteristics. Some of this land you won't even see any stumps because it hasn't been logged in that long. So some of it's pretty special, very biodiverse. There are, if I speak like a forester, there are multiple age classes and multiple species types. and it's really a healthy forest. It also happens to
West Fitchburg.
northwestern corner of Fitchburg. It also happens to be the highest elevation land that the city owns.
Really?
Yes. So we were able to do that. I'm hopeful that people will come and visit it. I'd be happy to give people a tour of it. I'm also hopeful that other people might be inspired by what we did to do it on other parcels of land.
We're kind of talking about like a non-logging credit that you're providing the city in a way.
I did in that case. Another formulation, though, that might work for more of the city's lands if they're interested in doing it, is actually selling carbon credits on a market that exists. It was established in the state of California. And recently, Mass Audubon did this on 10,000 acres and was able to get $6 million for those 10,000 acres, putting that land into the carbon credit system. City of Fitchburg,
we have 4,000 acres.
North County Land Trust may be able to do this too. So I've been exploring that with the water department.
So maybe we could get $3 million just from selling.
Exactly.
Because we have 4,000 acres approximately with a conservation restriction.
Right.
So
well, actually, the conservation restriction only applies to the northern watershed, not to the southern watershed. But that doesn't matter for this possibility of getting carbon credits.
Yeah.
We could do it on the entire acreage or some portion of it.
Now, and North County Land Trust has recently brought together a lot of stakeholders because we're updating our strategic conservation plan. And one of these recent meetings, there were a number of folks from conservation commissions from towns that like Lunenburg and Westminster, even Sterling, Lancaster, towns, and all of these towns that have town forests that would also be interested in something like this, because again, that whole piece of it comes in, where's the revenue source for this? Like, so yeah, this is great, we love forests, we want to protect them, but what about the revenue? What about the money? Now, of course,
it seems the money value is so low, though,
Yeah.
the logging.
It can be quite low.
And the markets, and actually, we've recently, actually, for the Rome harvest, much of the timber that was standing in there was low quality in terms of for timber value, and so it was really chipped value wood,
like mulch,
for the bioprocessors and things like that.
Biomass plant.
And the market for that has really gone down, and it's really hard for people who have that as their livelihood right now, and so it does. We're at this intersection where yes, you want to support your local economies. But of course, when the timber market goes down, people take more trees out in order to make more money, rather than potentially leaving more because they're going to be able to cover their costs.
Yeah. It's like a
so
stock market. Maybe you hold on to the tree a little longer.
There's a chicken and egg thing there, and so you want to be able to support your local economies, and people are always going to be tied to the land that they live on, and the land is always going to be supporting us in some way, and it does. We just have to find ways to recognize and monetize the green infrastructure that the forests provide for us.
Yeah, the ecosystem services are really valuable, and they're not usually measured or thought about much.
Well, if you look at China, the smog, like the smog level in China sometimes is unbearable.
Yeah.
Right.
And they, maybe, I don't know exactly the role of forests that plays, but we usually have generally high quality air. When you look at our air quality index.
We do. And one of the reasons for that is because we live in such a large forested area.
Yeah, right.
And
New England is about 60% forest.
Yeah, and in terms of like threats to the, if you zoom out to the globe, everybody talks about what's the number one thing that's going to be the most valuable thing on Earth. It's water.
Fresh water.
What does Fitchburg have? Bucos, amounts of fresh water. I mean, Fitchburg is actually one of the best situated or best the communities
Future planning.
In our area,
fresh water.
In our area, I mean, we are really in a great situation when it comes to that. And one of the reasons why is that we have this watershed protection, the forests that are protecting those waters, and you know, and the supporting landscapes around that as well. And if food security, I mean, we could go on and on and on about it. Like, it all ties back to this land that's supporting us.
I'd like to share with you that I learned recently that the cities of Westfield, Holyoke, and West Springfield, kind of cities not too dissimilar from Fitchburg, recently went into the process of selling 5,000 acres worth of carbon credits.
Aha!
And
how much did they get?
I don't think it's it's been finalized yet. I think they're in the middle of a process that takes a few years. But we could emulate what they're doing with their municipal forests.
Now you mentioned that about the Audubon Society. Their term was is that like 100?
I think it's 100-year commitment. Yeah. They have to maintain at least as much stocking in their forest as the initial baseline assessment says that they have. They can manage the forests, although you can get more money if you promise to have an unmanaged forest.
Really?
There's a kind of a calculation that you can go through and decide.
If it costs, if we get $10,000 to log 200 acres, but instead if we don't log it and we could get the equivalent, what's the equivalent value?
Yeah, that assessment needs to be done. It needs to be talked about. And I think it could be a really good decision for the city and for the area if we were to go down that road.
I like it. I like it, Ralph.
We'll see.
Yeah, we could get a big chunk of funds from forests that we are not going to cut down anyway, because those forests are protecting our water.
Right.
That's right.
Right.
So what are some, now when we talk about forest management, right, we can talk about there's managing the forest for logging. That would be, I guess, the worst case. The way to...
Let's be careful, because there are probably some people watching who, as Anna referred to, they may look at their woodlot as kind of their retirement nest egg. So we're not saying that everybody has to, stop cutting all their trees everywhere. After all, we do use and benefit from the products that come from forests. What I'm really thinking about here is, let's think about a different way of managing our publicly owned forests in particular, and then maybe we'll find that some private landowners, like North County Land Trust, for example, would decide to make some different decisions about how they manage their forests too. But not everyone will want to go that route. It depends.
Right. So on a scale with managing it by logging, or not managing it at all as a management strategy. So how does managing a forest to prevent forest fires come into play?
Well, I can talk about that if you like. Would you rather?
Oh no.
I mean,
I'm not as well versed in that. I do know that
with the recent California,
what I learned,
President Trump claims it's because they won't let us rake the forest.
Well, in fact, what I have learned is that where the forest went through Paradise, it didn't burn most of the trees. It burned the highly combustible homes, which people hadn't done a good job of making defensible areas around their homes. And once a home starts burning, it's so hot, it would jump to the next home and the next home. Embers would fly and ignite new homes. But the forests in that area had actually been managed. They had gone through harvests right in the adjacent forests. And in fact, the less managed forests withstand and are more resilient against wildfires than the ones that are more managed, contrary to what our president is claiming.
So by not managing our forest, by letting the forest manage itself, that that manages the forest fire.
And why is that? Because it's cooler, shadier, damper, and it's not as combustible when there's a closed overstory and when the forest is let alone. When you start opening it up, a lot of small, young combustible plants will grow into the sunny spots between where the trees were, and that is in a drought, like they've had a terrible drought, that allows the wildfires to really run rampant.
Often through lightning?
Actually, a bunch of these were started apparently by utility sparks and things like that. Yeah.
So, and I also want to mention that the California woodlands and the California ecology is much different than New England.
Yes.
And
a lot drier.
A lot drier. They have a rainy season and they have a dry season, and it's a totally different ecology than where we live.
It's
now,
actually,
not saying that
it's dependent on forest fires to run through those forests, and they've been suppressed for so long that the fuel built up.
So the California forests are sort of built to withstand the fires because they're supposed to go through regularly. The forest fires are that's sort of part of their ecology, and there are forests on the East Coast that are fire dependent. But they're on the coast, usually at the scrub open
pines
pine.
on like Cape Cod.
Right, exactly. Right. So there are entities that do control burning for the forest health in those forests, and not that we're not vulnerable to forest fires, but it's not something that is common or. It's not something that...
It's not something we can prepare for?
We shouldn't worry about it.
Yeah.
I don't think, in the same way that they do in California.
Here, it's almost like the other side of the coin. California and western areas, and actually southeast too, have been having widespread droughts. The trends in the northeast are for more frequent heavy rains, and we've been seeing that over the last number of years, and the National Weather Service has tracked that trend very, it's very obvious that for us, we'll probably not be worrying so much about those long, multi-year droughts. Instead, we'll probably have, too much rain here.
Well, we get all their water.
Right.
Exactly.
And I do have to, there may be some of your viewers who know more about this than I do in terms of forest fire ecology, because that's not my strong suit. So I don't want to speak out of turn, but I would say that in all of my background in education and for the Northeast forest ecology, fire is something that happens occasionally. It will burn in a certain area, and it's not easily spread because of the way that our forests, the topography, we have wetlands up the wazoo. So it will burn certain sections and will get stopped by water bodies, which we have a ton of.
I actually fought some fires when I was younger. Here in the Northeast, they can be pretty scary,
not
but
saying that they're
not very big.
Right, it's not on the scale of California is basically my caveat. But having said that.
Okay, so off of fire, another issue with management is, besides the ecology and the climate, it's actually seeing the destruction, like in your logging lands. So what you might have a recreational trail that you walk in the northern watershed, and then they log a whole bunch of it, and they leave it looking like this.
And that's actually, this was right along a recreational trail where I took this picture.
And it just frankly looks terrible.
If we could go to the last slide, perhaps, Sam.
The last slide?
Yeah.
Can we go to the last slide, please?
Because I think you're bringing up a topic that I really was hoping to be able to touch on. Slide 16.
Oh, there we go.
It's so important for people to get out and see what these forests look like and enjoy them. Our trails group here in Fitchburg recently produced a map of the trails in our city.
We have a great the Fitchburg Trail map. We have a great trail map.
Fantastic.
And thank you. We have about 35 miles of non-motorized recreational trails in Fitchburg, which is a lot for a city.
It's very abundant.
Yeah.
And one of my feelings is that we really have to get our kids out into nature and have them come to appreciate them, because they spend a lot of time on screens. And you know, if they don't start to love the natural world around us, when we're gone, who's going to care? It's really important, and it's also wonderfully fun.
You got to culture this. You got to kind of grow this.
And North County Land Trust has lots of family-friendly programs. So
you do. You're doing that. I think that one of the reasons that we produced our trail map, the Fitchburg Trail Guide, in Spanish as well as in English, is we recognize there's a lot of people who may not even know about our trails but live here and would benefit by them. They're accessible from pretty much everywhere in the city.
Everywhere you are, there's a recreational trail nearby.
Crocker is less than a mile from the boulder.
What?
Crocker Conservation Area is less than a mile from the boulder.
Yeah, and then Rollstone, and then our Rollstone Hill Trail, our Rock Walk
the Rock
Trail,
Walk,
that Fitchburg has $113,000 plus.
Yes, that's
already
very exciting.
Ready to go.
You know, being in forests can bring so much joy, healing, fun. You know, let's get out there and find out what we have, and hopefully from doing that we'll start to care more about them, and we'll all be the better.
And so these Fitchburg trail maps are available in a lot of places all throughout the city. They're at the Johnny Appleseed Center. They're at the library. They're Mill number 3.
The Historical Society.
Historical Society.
Yeah, there's really a lot of places.
City Hall.
Yes.
And then you can also go to fitchburgma.gov/trails. Right? And then you'll be able to go there, and the trail map itself is really beautiful, and it folds out and you can take it on the run. But the great thing about the online map is that you can go out while you're on a trail and zoom in to the insets and see exactly where you are.
On your smartphone.
On your smartphone.
Or you can print out the trail maps and bring them with you.
And there's a lot of detailed smaller maps available on the website where you can really go and explore all the different places in the city. The 35
and Crocker
miles
Conservation
of
Area that the North County Land Trust manages is one of the areas that we have on the trail guide.
Oh yeah, Crocker Conservation is a great place, and there's often is there still weekly Wednesday walks?
It's actually they're on Tuesday now.
Oh, okay.
But yes, every week we have a guided walk up there. It's Tuesday at, I believe it starts at 11
a.m. Yep. But it changes throughout the year based on the season
so check
and the lighting.
The Facebook or our website, either place.
North County Land Trust.
Yep, and we have
owl prowls. Those are my favorites.
We have fungus walks or mushroom walks.
The thing with the frog and the ice cream.
Yes, yeah, bugs, frogs, and ice cream.
Yeah.
Not just in Fitchburg, but also all around. So Lunenburg, Hubbardston, Templeton. So
it is still deer hunting season, so take some care depending on where you walk.
Yes, there's no hunting allowed at Crocker, but I would always wear hunter orange this time of year.
Just in case.
Just in case.
Yeah, because it's hunting season now.
It's the end of deer season right now.
All right, so you can go to the North County Land Trust website. You can go to the North County Land Trust Facebook page, and then there is also the Fitchburg Greenway Committee. These Fitchburg Greenway Committee and the Fitchburg Trails Vision Committee, facilitated the trail guide with the city of Fitchburg and a number of other organizations. So you can go to the Fitchburg Greenway Committee Facebook page and learn all about what they're doing as well, which is also helping to do the rock walk at the Rollstone Hill Trail. So we have about 10 seconds. You want to just add anything?
Enjoy
There's
your
also
woods.
Mass Audubon.
Mass Audubon, the Audubon
Flat Rock
Society.
Sanctuary. There's Cogs Hall Park, which is a wonderful asset that the city has. So go out and enjoy your natural assets here in this city.
Yeah,
awesome.
it's
All right.
great. Yeah.